Today, my guest is John Breen, the director of the documentary 3 Days, 2 Nights, which is a longitudinal exploration of two brothers who were the only people in their family, the Godfrey family, to survive a plane crash, and who then went on to manage to survive on their own as young boys in the snowy mountains of Aspen until several days later they were eventually rescued. John, welcome.
Thank
Uh,
you, Andrew. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I know you have a very personal connection to this story. Can you share it with the audience?
Sure, Andrew. It's a it's a very personal connection. The Godfrey family were close family friends of ours, of my family, the Breen family. My parents and their parents were very close friends. And at the time of their accident, this was in 1974, Mark and Andy, who survived the crash, and which the story is about, they were 11 and 9, and I was 10 years old. So we were very, very close friends, but spent a lot of days at their house. They spent a lot of days at our house. And I think it was that closeness and knowing them before the crash that inspired me so much to tell their story because watching close friends of yours go have that experience, have that tragic experience, and watch them come back from that. It's incredibly inspiring.
Did you stay in touch? I know that after the tragedy, they lived for a long time in Aspen. Did you stay in touch with them even though you lived in different parts of the world?
We did stay in touch, of course. You know, immediately after the accident, the crash, we saw them quite a bit, and of course they ended up moving to Colorado. We were down in Houston, of course, where they were from. Um, However, we managed to get together. They would visit Houston. We'd see them there, and we I spent a couple of New Years up in Colorado and saw Mark and Andy then, and we made time for each other and never lost track of each other, and certainly I didn't lose track of them. And I watched their lives unfold because they had big challenges after the accident, and they lost their parents, and Mark, of course, had his serious personal injuries, and and so I watched them. We stayed in touch, and watched their growth, watched them begin new lives, start new lives, and again, the way they managed it, incredibly inspiring, and again, it's what made me want to make this film.
Just for the audience watching who are filmmakers, if there is one thing you wish you had known before making the film, what would it have been? Any kind of tip?
Um, well, we chose to do this sort of in a verite manner style, and maybe I possibly would have thought about writing a little bit of it before. We really wanted to capture though the two now men, Mark and Andy, experiencing this catharsis they were going through, and in order to do that, I think we needed to have it completely spontaneous. But sometimes I do think about, it would have been nice if we'd planned a little of it, but I think the way it worked out was fine. And I think as far as I don't, there was so much that I already knew about the story that I didn't there weren't a lot of things I didn't think about prior. So I'd say the big one was just the style. And but I'm glad the way we did it. It did require 120 hours of filming, which I think if we had written some, we probably would have done it in 20 to 30. The editing might have been a little easier as well. So the process would have been more efficient for sure to have written some of it up. But I think ultimately the having done it in the verite style and more spontaneous, I think we got more honest answers. I think we got more honest emotions.
Well, the outcome was fantastic. I mean, it's an incredibly powerful film. So, whatever you did, thank you for doing it.
Well,
You
thank you, Andrew.
One thing that's really quite notable is you use a lot of archival footage, and you do quite an extraordinary job of blending different kinds of archival footage with current day interviews and other footage. Um, I know from experience that filmmakers are often very daunted by working with archival footage. Was What kind of challenges did you face and how did you overcome that?
Well, first of all, we were very, very lucky that Mark and Andy's parents loved taking video of their family. Back then, I guess it was just film. They had their little Super 8 camera. So we were very, very lucky that we had boxes of old archival video footage to go through. And 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 I would say it allowed us to I think explore time and the passage of time. I think that was an incredibly valuable thing to see what these guys were like prior to the crash. It also, for an audience member, you know, it it allows an audience member to harken back to their childhood, to remember what the 70s were like, what the 80s were like. And I think it captured, sort of the American experience. It helped capture the American experience a little bit. This is somebody's American story. And I think that's where I think it was very, very valuable. Um, and I think it also allowed us to get a sense of the parents as well, and the brother and the sister that were also on the plane that day. Um, and it helped give you an idea of the family and just how close the family was. So I think that archival footage was really, really valuable to making the film, as well as I think even the music was a little bit of a character in that film as well, and uh, and I think that those things combined, that archival footage with old music, that's very pertinent to the story and very personal to the story. I think those two things really, really kind of elevated the story.
Do you, given how close you are with both of them, how did you balance your sense of responsibility as a filmmaker to tell an authentic story with sensitivity to the trauma that your two friends obviously endured and still need to cope with day in and day out?
That was a big challenge. Even they moved after the accident. They moved to Aspen, as you mentioned earlier, and they moved in with their aunt and uncle and cousins. And I think there was even trauma around that. I think even the aunt and the uncle and the cousins, they needed to sort of be prepared for what was going to happen and the fact that this thing was coming again. But for the boys, they had spoken about it so little that I think that there was a lot of fear on their part about what would happen when they started speaking. And I think, as you'll see in the film, when Mark starts speaking about it, he doesn't get 30 seconds into it before, right, just initially, before he sort of breaks down emotionally. And so I think the big thing was for them to make sure that this experience was going to be there'd be comfort in it while they were exposing things that they had not exposed in so long. And then from my perspective as a filmmaker and a close friend, that I did not want the audience, or nor did I want them or anybody close to them, to think that there was any kind of you know taking advantage of their story for my good.
Right.
I think though that the biggest thing is that since we knew each other so well, there was a tremendous amount of trust between us, and those guys trusted me implicitly, explicitly, everything, and that made a big difference. And they allowed themselves to go places they might not have gone with other people. And so I think that trust thing was probably the most important thing to getting as authentic a film and emotions as we could, making that make during the process of the making of the film.
Well, the result certainly bears witness to their trust was very well placed in you. I
Well,
mean,
well, thank you, Andrew.
I you were talking about when they were living with when they'd moved in with their aunt and uncle, and I was personally struck by that at that time the aunt and uncle clearly decided that it was best for everyone just not to talk about it. And I would imagine today they might have had a different attitude. What do you think?
I think they would for sure today. First, I was just reminded that your wife's family lived maybe
Next
next
door.
door.
No,
To,
they shared a backyard.
is
It's
that is
crazy. Yeah,
incredible, Andrew.
right. I know.
So so yes, I think that the relatives, close friends, did not want them to dwell on this and make it the defining moment of their life. Like everything was going to be about this. Every part of their life, they could fall back and say, well, we had the accident. I think they wanted them to move on, to move on and think positively about their lives going forward, which in some sense was great advice, but in other ways, repressing all that emotion is not the healthiest thing. I think today, any psychologist, psychiatrist would tell you the first thing to that you have to do to deal with anything is to talk about it and to be honest about it and to share your feelings and thoughts, and by keeping them inside you, it's going to affect your life in all kinds of ways by not talking about it. And I think Mark, again, I'll use Mark as a good example. I think he had so much bottled up inside him, and you could almost see it. It just caused tension in his life. He didn't want to ever tell anybody why he limped. He would make up excuses for other things. He didn't want people to really know his story. I think once he started, I think once he came to grips with the fact he was going to do this film, I think he looked at it as an opportunity to share a story, inspire people through his story, but also to help himself and to sort of have some closure. And the idea that he never really had said some of these things out loud in his entire life was remarkable, stunning almost. So I'm not kidding. Halfway through the filming of this film, Mark was a different person. His shoulders were more relaxed. He was more relaxed. He was more open. He could be himself. There's a lot to be said about, self-actualizing and being your authentic self. And I think this sort of helped Mark in both those areas.
Incredible. I mean, yeah, and you see that ongoing in the film that they're helping others who have gone through trauma, and
Sure.
it's about sharing the experience.
Sure.
Well, thank you for sharing your experience with us through this fantastic film. One final question, which I'm pretty sure you didn't know when you were making it, but I'd love to have your insight that films about people who have survived plane crashes are incredibly popular with audiences. Do you have any insight as to why that may be? I mean, in talking about the film you made with others and seeing audiences interact with it, participate with Q&As and the like, do you have any sense of why that that particular kind of accident really captures the imagination of people?
I think because we all fly, we are all on planes, we all wonder what it would be like what would happen. We've all been on a plane probably where there's been enough turbulence to like, oh my gosh, what if that had been the deal?
Yeah.
And and I think there's probably a slight morbid curiosity with wanting to know what is it like in those 20 or 30 seconds before there's a crash. I think there's also, I think, a lot of curiosity and interest about what happens after that crash. You rarely hear about what happens to the people afterward. I think maybe Sully Sullenberger, we heard about him, but generally, the average person that's in a plane crash, you don't hear anything about how it affects their life. So I think it's an A and a B thing. It's definitely like we've all been on planes. We all want to know, like we all would like to know. It's almost like going to war, like those of us that have never fought in war. It's like it would be interesting to do it for a day, and have that fear and knowing that you could lose your life, and but I think that's maybe similar to the way it is with plane crashes, that it's like the biggest fear in your life happening, and I think that certainly if you're fortunate enough, like Mark and Andy were, to survive a tragedy like that, I think it's a natural thing that an audience member may just want to, wow, I want to know what they went through. What was that like? And I think that was, you asked, through the Q&As that I've done in the past, what did I learn about that? And I think people wanted even more information about it. We don't in the film, it was pilot error was the reason for the crash, but we don't dwell on that. We're not blaming. I don't want to blame the pilot. He has 5 or 6 children, living children himself, and he passed away during the crash. So people wanted to know more about that. They want, like, why didn't you go into like what he did? And it's like, well, first of all, we don't even have some of that information because the boys were 9 and 11. They were in absolute shock. They don't even remember some of the things. But I think to survive a crash, people want to know what it was they experienced and how how it changed them.
And maybe it gives them hope too, that when the unimaginable, horrible thing you fear happens, there's some sort of sense of reassurance that, well, these guys survived.
That's you hit it on the nose. That's for sure, Andrew. And I think it's one of the themes in the film is hope. They're 9 and 11 when this happens, and you just hope. And I think when I was a child, even I saw them during some of their worst moments. That all I could think was I just hope that they're happy one day again. And sure enough, they are. They've both got great families, and their fathers, their husbands, and they're great friends, and they've had great lives, even with, withstanding the terrible tragedy that they did.
Well, let's end on that note, which is a nice one. And
Good
thank
deal.
you so much for this film.
Sure.
And thank you for taking the time today.
Andrew, thank you for all the kind things you said, and great seeing you and great talking with you today.
See you soon. Bye.